If there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that humans will believe almost anything. On Blasphemy with Chris and Marnie, we take a look at some of these beliefs, uncover their very human origins, how they've developed and changed over time, and the very real consequences they had in society and culture. Impacts that continue even today in our lives. Welcome to Blasphemy. My name is Chris Teddy, and with me, as always, is Marnie. How you doing?
I'm good.
Cool. Just real quick, if you want to find us, we're at blasphemypodcast.com. You can obviously find us at all the podcast places you get podcasts, and so if you could, that'd be awesome if you followed us, rated, reviewed, whatever they allow you to do there. If you dig it, share it with your family and friends. That'd be awesome. One of our friends shared it. We love her. Shout out, Jenny. But she put it probably the right way, which is like, hey, you should listen to this unless you're easily offended. And it's like, I hope, if you know someone, though, or you belong to some group that would dig this kind of stuff, share it with them. That'd be cool. It'd help expose us. So tonight, I'm not even going to introduce a topic. I'm not even going to say what it's about. It'll become apparent what it's about. But I decided I'm just going to jump in and instead just start telling the story.
Okay, I know what it's about, but I don't know
You
the
do, but don't
details.
say anything. Because one, I fucking wrote it that way, so that's how we're doing it. And then two, this one's not going to necessarily be short.
I'm going to be afraid to blow it.
Don't blow it.
For your punchline.
Yeah, don't blow it. But this one's going to be long. It's going to be a giant history lesson to a large extent.
I like
What is that? A GHL, if you will. And so I also needed to make it interesting, or try to. So hopefully this works. So we're just going to jump in.
Yeah,
we're going to go. You ready?
Let's go.
For millennia, humankind was engaged in a continual war. One we were losing. It wasn't a conventional war of empires, armies, and kingdoms. Those were more manageable and understandable. You could see the enemy coming, get people to safety, prepare to fight. You could reason, compromise, even make peace with the enemy. It made sense, at least. The battle lines for this war, though, could not have been simpler. It was us, all of us, versus it. You see, the real main character of the story is not a person. It's not a movement, a religion, or a country. It's a thing, an invisible, undetectable, uncaring force. It would attack completely unannounced, making its presence known only when it was too late. It was a clever enemy finding the perfect victim for its murderous ways. An animal that was social, close, connected. They loved to touch each other, lived together in groups, dwelled together in enclosed spaces, shared food, cuddled their children, kissed their lovers. They were perfect. Completely unseen and unknown, it would descend on a population laying waste to all who lived there in a matter of weeks. When it came through a human settlement, it left devastation in its wake. Up to half were left dead once the enemy had ravaged through their villages and towns. Those that managed to survive the vicious onslaught were left scarred, disfigured, and quite often blind for the rest of their lives. Sometimes this ancient, mysterious enemy would attack, moving quickly to stay ahead of the human forces that were responding to their sneak attack. Other times, they would find the human defenses weakened and impotent, helpless in the face of its overwhelming power, making quick work of its deadly purpose. And yet, there were some humans who seemed to be ready for them, having learned from previous attacks, emboldened, and appeared to be especially trained in the enemy's tactics. No matter, though, because this ancient threat didn't need to win every battle to survive and increase in power. Its way was about moving, striking as many as possible, using even the most well-defended territory as a bridge to other, easier targets. From what can be determined, this terrifying enemy first launched their all-out assault thousands of years ago, probably sometime around 10,000 BCE. When the mummy of Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses V was examined, the signs of this ancient scourge were found on his body. He died over 3,000 years ago. Going even further back, this enemy seems to have been described in ancient Sanskrit medical texts from around 1500 BCE. It ravaged through populations in Africa, the Middle East, Greece, and eventually found its way into Europe, from where it would be carried to the New World by human explorers, traders, and conquerors. During the 18th century, this enemy killed over 400,000 Europeans per year. 5 ruling monarchs were killed by it. 1/3 of the blind population had lost their sight in a fight with this ancient enemy. They were considered lucky. Up to 60% of adults who fell victim to it lost their lives. When it came to children, the mortality rate was up to 80%. This thing was the nightmare of waking nightmares. Fear, uncertainty, hopelessness, that was the human experience for a long, long time. It was actually known by many names: the Red Plague, the Speckled Monster, and countless other dreaded monikers entombed in the minds of those whose lives it erased. However, in the West, we settled on the name with which it would be forever branded. It is known as smallpox. And though you and I have never once had to give it so much as a thought, it once killed our children, our parents, our siblings. It could wipe out entire villages or populations, using them as transportation to other human societies where it could do its dark work. It could strike at any time, be transmitted by anyone, and once it was recognized, it was already way, way too late to do anything but dig a bunch of graves and prepare for the aftermath. So, this is like the story, right? I don't know why. It makes me emotional to talk about this. I've been cramming my head through, and it's like, holy shit, I didn't even think about this. And that's kind of the point of the story, is that we don't think about this. And there's a reason we don't think about this.
Yeah.
Because we would be thinking about this without this story. And, we don't have to go that far back. Like probably maybe our grandparents.
Yeah.
And then thousands of years as far back as probably human civilization goes from there. This fucking ruled our thoughts.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just, people died. It had a deep psychological, economical, societal impact.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this thing, when it hit people, and it's a weird disease, right? So we're dealing with an epidemic right now. Mm-hmm. So the reason it's called an epidemic is because it comes from demos, which means the people, and epi, which means like upon or to come upon. Mm-hmm. So an epidemic is a disease that suddenly descends on a population. Mm-hmm. It's new. It came in from the outside, right? That's what we're dealing with coronavirus, for instance. However, there are also diseases that are endemic. That's like the cold virus or the flu. It's always in us, always around us. It's a part of our life. Mm-hmm. It used to be epidemic. Mm-hmm. It used to fucking kill a lot of people, like the flu, for instance. Mm-hmm. But now it's just a disease that we know happens. People still do die from it, but we have all kinds of ways. And generally it's descended into this thing that doesn't disrupt our lives other than we might feel like shit for a week once a year, or something like that. Yeah. There are many doctors that are saying that coronavirus will probably become that. Yeah. Just another thing that we deal with. Mm-hmm. Smallpox was both. Mm-hmm. Okay, so this thing was the darkest, most horrible thing that we dealt with, and it was a continual thing we dealt with. Mm-hmm. And the issue was because of the fact that it was an epidemic at times, and yet it was endemic. Like most of the kids had been infected. This is a time when I know now we like have it when a child dies or miscarriage or stillbirth, it's like devastating because that doesn't make sense to us. Babies are born and have long lives. Mm-hmm. They did not have that world. That was a fucking fantasy. 35% of your children died. Okay. If they caught smallpox naturally, the infant mortality rate, like up to 5 years old, was about 80%. So if your kid got smallpox, you're pretty much losing that kid. But the ones who lived would have this resistance to it, right? And so what would do is it kind of descend into this endemic disease where the kids have it, and then a generation of adults that don't have it kind of through immigration, people coming in from other places, or it had kind of like subsided, and so they didn't get exposed as kids, but they're older, and all of a sudden it'd become an epidemic, and it would fucking wipe out half the goddamn adults.
Okay.
There were a period of times where the only development that was reported in the year or years that a smallpox outbreak went on was increasing graveyards.
Yeah.
Bodies were piling up in churchyards. They were full. They had to fucking just find places to bury people. I mean, this was not... It was fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Right? And if you lived through it, it left you with a telltale. About 50% of the population at this time, their faces were covered in pockmarks. Their heads. So when you would get smallpox, it would go through about a 2-week kind of period where you felt like shit, like the flu almost. Aches. A lot of the stuff you hear about with the coronavirus, right? And then, but also a lot of intestinal stuff and diarrhea and vomiting, and you're just kind of weak and you're just really, really getting worse, right? And then after about 2 weeks, these fucking lesions start forming. And they typically form on your head and face first, and then move down your trunk. And they go and they fill your mouth, and they cover your tongue, and they go down your fucking throat, and they go into your genitals, and they go into your eyes to where your eyes swell shut. And then they start infecting your retinas, and then... If you live through that, you are left with scarring. There are patches of your head where hair no longer grows. You know, all those fashions that arose, like big wigs and big white makeup? It's because their fucking faces were destroyed by smallpox, and their hair was all didn't grow anymore, and their heads were so scarred that it just was coming in all kinds of crazy things. Like, it impacted society. It changed history. Sometimes, like I read, like monarchs died because of it. So, for instance, you know, like Queen Elizabeth, not the one now, but the first Queen Elizabeth, right? The Elizabethan age Elizabeth, right? Well, she came to the throne because her half brother, who was the heir to the throne, died of fucking smallpox, and then Mary, right? Stuart, Bloody Mary. We can thank her for the awesome drink we can drink on Sunday mornings, but Bloody Mary, she died of what they said was the flu, but some debate that it actually was smallpox as well. Elizabeth got smallpox, lived through it, okay? Pockmarked face. That's why all her pictures, she has heavy white makeup and fake wigs and shit like that. Meanwhile, it throws their country into chaos. They have a literal constitutional crisis. Like, they have no ruler. Their heirs are gone. They fucking are thrown into this thing. And in the midst of this, a particular faction kind of gets their way, and they sign this edict saying no more Catholic kings in fucking England. And since Elizabeth was a Protestant, she came to power. And so the House of Stuart fell. And then, the House of Hanover, Elizabeth's family, then rose to power. And so a whole ruling family switched hands because of this. So, and add to that the psychological impact that this had on people, okay? Having a baby was a fucking intense experience back then. Not only did you fear for your own life, because that happened a lot, but... the chances of your kid, this wasn't a time when you had a baby and you had this baby shower and said, oh man, they have their whole life ahead of them. I'm so excited to see the person they become.
Yeah. I hope they make it. I don't know that we can, like our other episode that we talked about rational thinking or not rational, that we can only project ourselves today into that. And so you're saying, imagine having a baby back then. It's like, I can't.
I can't either.
It would be a totally different feeling because I expect my babies to live.
Right.
Obviously not all babies do even today, but it's a general expectation so that we're devastated when they don't. But if you have an expectation that maybe half the babies live or something, you have a totally different feeling about having a baby.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, it was a different.
I can't comprehend,
and they couldn't comprehend our way.
Yeah,
they longed for our way, I'm sure, but they probably imagined, you know, things like heaven and stuff would be like that kind of stuff. But that wasn't the real world. Not only that. Marriage largely declined at this time too because everyone's face is fucked up. I mean, it's just like a reality. It's true. It sucks, but it's true that it created a whole class of women who in this time were a marginal society. If you weren't married, there were not a lot of opportunities for you to make your own way. So it created this whole poverty class. I mean, there was just, this thing ruled us. And unlike any other thing, we had no fucking idea what it was. We had for thousands of years, it was just this ghost that happened. And we came up with all kinds of reasons. Cultures even created gods that were associated with it and worshiped them and tried to appease them.
Trying to get some control over their environment.
Right. I mean, this thing was not just something that was in the background. It determined the way we looked at life, the hopes we could have, the expectations we had, and things like that. A lot of times people will be like, man, back then they sure accomplished a lot before they're 24. You had to. If you made it past 10, you better get on the stick. Because if you're curious, your life is going to be over soon, so you better start doing shit. And so, don't compare yourself to them, because I'm going to tell you the story of how we got here, which is better. Okay. So tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of this war. It is quite literally the story that has made all of our lives possible. The expectations, dreams, goals, and possibilities we walk this world with is a very recent development. Going back to your great-grandparents or maybe your great-great-grandparents' lives and then back thousands of years, that was not the world we lived in. Our story begins in a quaint little English town called Barkley. It's spelled Berkeley, by the way, but Jesus Christ. In the county of Gloucestershire, which is spelled Gloucestershire. But anyway, I heard how it was pronounced. It's Barkley in the county of Gloucestershire. Man, very British. Or like New England, I guess. If you go back to Massachusetts and shit, they do the same thing. But anyway, in this little town, in the country, it's like don't think London, this is like moo, this is like countryside, okay? It was May 17th, 1749, and the Reverend Stephen Jenner, together with his wife Sarah, welcomed a baby boy into their family. They named him Edward Jenner. While there must have been some joy in the moment, the couple were still reeling from bearing one of their other sons only weeks earlier. A victim of smallpox, and not the only one of his siblings who had fallen to the disease. Okay? This was the life, right? Yeah. Edward was the 8th of what would be 9 children. Only 6 would survive to adulthood. That was normal. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. And the more kids you had, the more you lost.
Yeah.
At 5 years old, Edward lost both of his parents to infectious disease. Not smallpox, but within 2 months of each other, both his parents were dead, and he found himself an orphan. Now, Edward's father was appointed the vicar of the area, and this was something given as a gift by the Earl of the territory. The Jenners were landed, moneyed, and friends with local nobility, so don't get any Oliver Twist pictures in your head. Apart from losing his mom and dad, he was going to be fine. He was rich. Okay, he was born into a family of prominence. At the age of 8, he was sent to, this is the name of the grammar school he went to. I went to Township Elementary. Where'd you go?
Indian Hills Academy.
Right, yeah.
Faith Baptist.
He went to, at 8 years old, he was sent to Wooton Under Edge Grammar School. So British. He would only spend a year here. However, while he was there, a smallpox outbreak happened, resulting in the students, including Edward, being variolated. Okay? To get a handle on what this was all about, let's take a side tour in our tale because it is crucial in understanding this story. So we're going to have to leave young Edward here. Okay?
He was variolated?
Variolated. Okay, don't worry. I'm not going to leave you there. Hey, what? You don't know what that is? I didn't fucking know what that was. Okay. But anyway, up until this point, Edward, who by all accounts was a very curious and kind of, busy child and a little rich brat that got to do whatever he wanted to, but he gets sent to school. And why is there? Smallpox outbreak. Okay. And as we're going to see at this time, there was a procedure that was done when this happened or prior to this.
Is a procedure?
We're going to find out. I'm going to tell you what it is. Don't worry. Hold your horses. But okay, just to set the stage. But we're going to have to take a side tour to talk about this. Okay. Because this is super important. Okay. In the context of this tale. It was referred to as variolation because the scientific taxonomy of the smallpox virus had been recently established, naming the virus variola. Okay. So, like the Latin names like Homo sapien, well, the virus was given the name variola. And there was actually two strains of the virus. There was variola majora and variola minora. And obviously one was worse than the other. And, but variolation is tied to that. Okay. Because the virus was named just like coronavirus. Well, this one was called variola. Okay. You could say they had variola virus, right? But that was way too nice a name for this thing that was horrific. It was like the leading cause of blindness during these hundreds of years was this, right? It was a fucked up thing. So variolation was a procedure that involved infecting children and adults with small doses of the smallpox virus in an attempt to trigger a minor outbreak of the disease, leaving lasting immunity. They would come down with smallpox, but typically not a severe or life-threatening case. So what we had observed, right? Because we're humans and we're looking for patterns. We're looking for shit to make sense. We're trying to piece this puzzle together. What we had noticed and what we'll see a long time ago was that if you got smallpox and lived, the next time smallpox came through, you didn't get it. And so they understood that we saw this, right? And so what we started to do was get ahead of the game by giving you a little bit of smallpox or trying to, right? And causing you to go through the disease but live, and then you'd be protected, right? And when you're talking about this dark scourge that stalked them all the fucking time and you couldn't see it coming, you were hoping for anything. If you even gave your kid a better percent chance than 80, or whatever, the 80% chance they're going to die if they get this thing, give me 50-50. I'd take that, kind of situation. While this sounds like some modern medical knowledge springing from European Enlightenment thinking, the understanding and practice stretches back far into our ancient past. The first textual evidence of the practice reaches back to China in the 1400s. They had actually ritualized the whole thing. They created special pipes, highly adorned and crafted from pure silver. They would collect the scabs from smallpox victims and dry them. They had figured out through experimentation that drying the scabs rather than using fresh ones resulted in a less severe bout of the disease. Once dry, they would grind the infected pus scabs into a powder and blow them up your nose using the pipe.
Oh, dear.
Males had scabs blown up their right nostrils, while females took them up the left.
Dear.
Interesting. Just listen to the last episode.
Gosh.
And while I'm on that, I just wanted something I should have done last episode. Totally off topic. Sorry, just side rail. But I mentioned the Satanic Temple and how they took donations to help women, with feminine hygiene products and like that. If you want to help and donate to that, just Google it's they call it menstruating with Satan, and if you look that up, it like menstruating, not ing with a n on the end with Satan. You can give, and they would gladly take any donation. It's fucking rad. And if you live in Seattle, they take literal products. You can just bring boxes of whatever you need. So. Anyway, back to our story. So, anyway, in China, now this isn't this is not the origin, but the first written down evidence, right?
Okay.
Now they had ritualized the whole thing. That takes time.
Yeah.
They had come up with special pipes. They didn't wake up one day and throw this together. This was a long time. They even did the right left thing, which I think is fucking so wild, right? Anyway, but just imagine this. They're going and finding infected people, collecting their scabs, which is just pus, dries them up, right? And sometimes they just collect directly the ooze that came out of their stuff.
Keep going.
Anyway, they dried it after experimentation, right? So they found this out, which meant they were doing it a different way and it wasn't going so well for a while. So obviously this was happening before, but in the 15th century, in the 1400s, China writes down that they were doing this.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And remember, Edwards, this is 350 years later. Okay, so I mean this is going back.
This is a practice.
Okay, yeah. Well, this is the first written evidence of inoculation through variolation. Okay, inoculation is this process. This is the origin of that inoculation.
Yeah.
Okay, was giving smallpox to people, hoping that it only resulted in at least a bout that they lived through, and then they would be protected.
Yeah.
Okay. Some researchers have suggested that evidence of the practice in India goes back hundreds of years before these Chinese details. It for sure was being practiced there prior to Europe. Africa also used variolation techniques prior to Europe. The problem with determining when these things started is that we only know of them because white people showed up and wrote down what they saw in the early 18th century or so, right? And so that's kind of our beginning point. It is likely these were very long-held traditions that had spread through trade, exploration, and conquest. For example, Sudanese mothers whose children had never been exposed would visit the mothers of infected children. The mother of the sick kid would tie a cloth around the kid's arm, covering a number of smallpox pustules. While the pus soaked into the cloth, the women would argue and haggle over the price to be paid for each pustule.
Oh, geez.
Once everyone was cool with the transaction, the visitor would return home, tie the cloth around her healthy child's arm, and expose them to a small amount of the virus to build immunity. In some communities, gifts and donations will be brought to women who are willing to sell or trade her sick child's pus. So they kind of turned it into a little way to like make some side hustle.
Oh.
I mean, your kid's may be dying, but got to make that money.
Exactly. Trying to save someone else's. Okay.
Yeah. And you can imagine, I mean, like you could do that a bunch of times. It lasted weeks. I mean, it wasn't like a quick thing. In the Ottoman Empire, they would make a small, very minor cut on the skin, almost like a scratch, and then rub smallpox pus into the wound.
Oh.
Through observation, research, and experimentation, our ancient ancestors had determined that people who were exposed to smallpox and lived remained resistant and immune from the disease from then on. They might not have known a lot of the whys or hows of the situation, but they had figured out a very, very big what. What to do to save people from this thing that is killing us relentlessly. The results were undeniable. Mortality rates through natural infection were as high as 80%. The mortality rate amongst the inoculated was 1 to 2%. Those are hard odds to bet against your lives and those of your children. So it was like, you know, fucking people got on board. Meanwhile, in Europe, the smart white folks considered all of this folklore and poppycock from dark-skinned savages who didn't know any better. They resisted the practice fully, with even the Royal Society rejecting it as science or a valid medical treatment, forbidding the practice in England. Like so many amazing stories, this one hinges on interesting people, characters. People who refuse to accept the status quo. People willing to fuck shit up a little bit for the greater good. Women and men willing to look beyond the boundaries and blinders we install through our religions, short-sightedness, and ethnocentricities. The first such character shows up in 1715. She was a 26-year-old aristocratic woman named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. So she was super white. Okay, this is like English aristocracy. Okay, Lady Mary, we'll call her. 2 years earlier, she had to bury her beloved brother after he was racked and destroyed by smallpox. And now she had the disease. After a few weeks of wondering if she would die that day, she somehow pulled through, alive, but left with the telltale marks of the disease. Her face was deeply and horrendously scarred by pockmarks and tissue destruction. Like their noses would get really big and swollen and red. They would lose sometimes pieces of their earlobes or chunks of their ears. Their eyes would lose that kind of like aliveness. They kind of clouded because it would attack like and so even if they didn't go blind, they typically lost at least eyesight, you know, acuity and shit. I mean, it was just it left you ravaged even if you fucking made it, you know. She was married to an ambassador, which meant she was well-traveled, finding herself in the most amazing places. It was in 1717 that she finds herself living in Turkey, her husband being assigned to the embassy there. While walking around Constantinople, she comes across people gathered with their children. As she moved closer, she witnessed a group of elderly women variolating them against smallpox. She had never seen nor heard of such a thing and quickly set out about learning more. So she's like touched by smallpox, right? So she's like watching this happen, kind of asking like, what the fuck is happening? A bunch of old women are kind of cutting kids' arms and putting something in it, you know, and she learns of this thing. So she seeks out a couple British doctors from the embassy and finds out that they had actually been studying this and been watching this and kind of asking, and they had written a paper. And they were super into this. They're like, no. I mean, we've studied this, we've observed, we've watched, we've recorded these results, and the shit works. They're super into it, right? So she's like all jazzed up about this thing, right? In fact, there's still a letter that exists that's in a museum somewhere over in England, from her to a friend, where she's describing this, and you can hear the excitement in her voice and like the hope of like, this is huge, right? Because at this time, we just hit 500,000 deaths from coronavirus. Okay. At this time through the 18th century, that's how many adults throughout Europe were dying a year from smallpox every fucking year. It was not every once in a while, once in a generation.
And the population wasn't even as large as the U.S.
No. And as many kids as you're having, well, there's fucking 35% of them are dying. I mean, it was terrible, right? And so she's seeing this as like, this we've got to fucking get on board with, because we are dying. Our children are dying. My face is fucked up. You know, like we don't need to do this, maybe, you know, kind of thing. So she's getting on one, right? Which is awesome. The next year in 1718, she had her 5-year-old variolated, bringing a British embassy doctor along to supervise and observe. His name was Charles Maitland. It fucking worked like a charm. So you couldn't do it in England, okay? It's totally rejected by other doctors that are like, you know, like brown people can't do that. And then she sees it, and she's talking to these doctors that are like, no, dude, it's the real deal. You can't fucking argue with the results. And so she like gets her kid, and she's like, fuck it, I'm going to do this, right? And so she brings a British doctor with them. His name's Charles Maitland, and she has her son variolated, inoculated. They cut his arm, and they rub some, you know, smallpox infected material into him. And, you know, it fucking worked. He lived, and, you know, he was good to go. She returns to England with Charles and begins pushing to have her 4-year-old son variolated in England in the presence of the physicians of the royal court. So she's fucking like becomes this one-woman campaign. Like, this is all she talks about. No matter who you are, she talks about it on the street corner. She talks about it to anyone. She's plugged into society, so anyone influential she can get her hands on, she's fucking saying, we need to stop this nonsense. This is real, and we could be saving lives. We could be saving our whole fucking world. And so she's all over the place. And I mean, she would eventually convince fucking the current Princess of Wales to be variolated along with her children. Like she did not stop, because she got a lot of rejection. This was not a smooth sailing thing. People weren't like listening to her. She kept fucking talking, you know. And she eventually says, "Here's the deal, okay? I will fucking bring my other son in. I think he was 5 at the time, and have this procedure done by a British doctor, right? That I think it was Charles Maitland probably, who studied it. I never really found that detail, but a doctor, and in front of the royal, the physicians, the court physicians, the people that were like the top medical minds and organization in the fucking country, right? And so they do, right? And it works too. And you know, at this point, they're like, oh shit, we can't argue against this anymore like that, right? I mean, this is like obviously something that's going to be positive, right? And it's really because of Lady Mary. She really, really pushed hard to bring this into England, who was resisting it at every turn. The British scientific and medical community began to think that maybe these savages are onto something. Remember Charles Maitland? Well, he decides he too is going to look into this and devises an experiment to gather further data. He selects 6 prisoners who had never been exposed to smallpox from Newgate Prison in London and proposes a deal. Allow him to inoculate them against smallpox, then expose them to the disease to see if it works or kills them. And if they live, They can skedaddle free as birds.
Get out of free.
Yeah.
Get out of jail free. Okay.
All six made a very quick decision, as their current life was living in a literal hell waiting to die of something, or at the hands of someone, no chance of freedom in all likelihood. Or they could take a chance, roll the fucking dice, and maybe walk out of prison with the added bonus of being immune to smallpox.
Yeah.
Right? Not a tough decision, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, you're sure you're going to die if you get it, but, you know, whatever, sweet release, I guess, at that point. He inoculated all six, waiting a period of time, and exposed them all to smallpox. All six showed no symptoms and demonstrated immunity to the disease. They all walked free. Probably to perpetrate more crimes, but we'll focus on the positive part of this story. It never said, like, and they weren't murderers. We don't know. They just had it. He just said, like, have you had smallpox? That's probably all he cared about.
Hopefully he picked people like that were in debtor's jail.
Yeah, I know. I'm just fucking around. I don't know. I doubt that
he's not like going to pick. He would know what they were in for.
Now, it wasn't like this procedure never had negative outcomes or unintended consequences. It wasn't perfect. It was just an infinitely better option than just naturally falling prey to smallpox. This was still giving them smallpox. You're infecting them with the disease, okay? Mm-hmm. And the point was to give them a small, minor version of the disease, but it didn't always work out that way, okay? For instance, the king we fought against in the American Revolution, his name was King George III. His little boy, Prince Octavian, what the fuck, was inoculated with this newly embraced medical treatment, fucking died a couple weeks later, right? The king. Okay, this is the one that we're like, down with the king here in America. Same king. His son died because of this procedure, trying to protect him, right? I'm sure the royal doctor spent some tense moments with the king over that one. You know, you'd be like, oh, fuck, you know, but... However, even with such setbacks and anecdotes of failure, variolation quickly became accepted by mainstream British medical thought and practice. The results were simply too undeniable and positive in light of the careful observation and data collection that they underwent. And of course, the grift was on at that point. Fucking capitalism, right? That's what happens. There was one very vital flaw to this whole procedure when it came to good old capitalistic greed. It was too damn simple. Anyone could do it. And so doctors began working to remedy this problem. If money was going to be made off of medicine, it was going to be them who made it. Where once it was a tiny scratch or superficial cut, something moms had been doing at home for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, these new medical entrepreneurs began using deep cuts that cause excessive bleeding, with the doctors claiming it was purifying the blood. This change in how variolation was performed by the supposed professional doctors meant people had to come to them, not comfortable with slicing their children open. The only reason to do this was to ensure the business came to them. That's it, right? So, of course, they turned it into this thing that was all doctorly and had to be performed by professionals, right? And it also introduced like a really weird complication in that all this bleeding and purging that they supposedly was making it better for the patient, you know, it's going to turn out that put them in a state that they had a lot of negative outcomes because they're weak by the time they do it. So, you know, they're fucking shit up. So pretty fucked up, right? It kind of gets even more fucked up in the other way, too. A family of English physicians called the Suttons had lost one of their own after an inoculation in 1757. The boy's father, Robert, swore right then he was going to find a safer, more effective way of doing this so others didn't have to suffer such a fate, if at all possible. 5 years later, in 1762, he announces and starts marketing what he called a new method for inoculation for smallpox. People lined up to protect their children, and soon his success rate was renowned. More and more flooded into his clinics, which grew to a network of buildings, facilities, and even franchises run by people he shared profits with. Under one condition, they don't share the secret of the Sutton method. By 1770, over 330,000 people had been inoculated in one of his variolation marts. It was a huge fucking deal, okay? So this guy, his success was real, and it was renowned, and next thing you know, it's like everywhere there's like a Sutton, you know, smallpox store or whatever. You go in and you get your fucking shit done. It was kind of like, I don't know, we have shit like that now, I guess, but It was an industry at this point. He had a brand. Eventually, Robert dies, and his oldest son, Daniel, takes over, writing a book later in life, recounting his family's rise to fame in the smallpox inoculation game. In it, he exposes the secret to their success. It turns out his father simply had gone back to the way they had been doing it in China, Africa, India, and the Middle East. Rather than open up a goddamn vein or something, he made a tiny scratch. He found that much of the damage done by inoculation was through the weakening of the patient through this bloodletting. Robert and his doctor's sons had also been very careful to harvest the scabs and pus from patients showing only the most mild expressions of the disease. Essentially, they were doing the same thing that had been done until the greed of the medical industry made it worse. And while we might think, how great of him returning to the wisdom of other cultures or the old ways, he also fooled people into thinking he was doing something proprietary and complex, holding their lives and hope hostage so they would come to him for their inoculations. So he isn't actually an angel in this for the most part. But the Sutton Center saved many, many lives. That is an unquestionable fact. Dude did do that. Was it shady? Sure. It was.
That was.
He's like, ooh, I figured out a new thing. Yeah. It's my proprietary. You know, when you buy those vitamins, it says a proprietary blend of, whatever. Yeah. You know, he's doing that. Okay.
So in the medical, well, that's what's happening now. Like, we get the medical industry fucking us and the fucking naturopaths fucking us.
We're getting fucked coming and going.
Coming and going.
Damn. Pick a side already. Okay. Maybe one of the best stories from this time comes from Scotland, in a place called Shetland. They had a doctor there. He had grown up his whole life in this town, a place that had seen their fair share of smallpox destruction. At times, anywhere from 30 to 50% of the locals had been wiped out. Some periods were so bad, people began to reckon years and ages using the devastating events as the starting point. They just started over. It was like everything ended.
Yeah.
And we mark our time now from the last smallpox outbreak because that was the end of the world, basically. And this is a new one. So fucking crazy. You think about something that ruled your mind that much and crazy. He never went to school, but instead started teaching himself science and medicine as a young man, eventually elevating to the position of town physician. He is also reported to have been quite skilled in tailoring, blacksmithing, clock repair, and even spent time as a weaver. He was a curious cat, to say the least, right? The point is, Shetland's town physician was a self-taught, uneducated local dude. Literally oh yeah, him. I remember him. Where did he go to school? Oh, he didn't go to school. You know, he just grew up there on the farm, but he's the doctor now, right? But this guy would wind up being the key to perhaps the very survival of their communities. He was given a name when he was born, but the name everyone came to call him by is way fucking better. So I'm going to use that one. They called him Johnny Notions. That's what they called him, Johnny Notions. That was your doctor, by the way. Can you imagine? Walking in, you're sitting in the waiting room. Coming, hi, I'm Johnny Notions. Hey, how you doing? And I found these are so anecdotal and who knows how historically accurate. But I did read in a couple different sources that the story behind this nickname his name was John.
Yeah.
They called him Johnny though, which makes me feel like this is the hippest doctor around. But he was visiting a businessman's home or something, some local rich fuck, and they're talking and conversing and doing what they did, and the guy was saying, if only I could get rid of these, they had these wood beetles that would make little ticking sounds or something. They called them checking beetles, and they called them checks, whatever. And it was driving him crazy, and he's like, and so Johnny fucking looks around and moves this clock and finds this nest where I don't know if they have queens or some shit, reason why they're all in this one thing, and removes it. He basically does what an exterminator does now. But I mean, he did that, and the guy exclaimed what a notion, or what notions you have, or what have you, and then Johnny Notions. That became his name. And that's how he's known in history, is Johnny Notions.
Okay.
Which is fucking cool shit. I love that though. Hi, I'm Notions, Johnny Notions. Anyway, he had a lot of ideas, is what they were saying. He was a thinker. Johnny had come up with a process by which he would wind up inoculating all 3,000 people in his town, seemingly not losing a single person in the process, and forever saving the family lines, demographics, and cultural traditions of his homeland, literally bringing a hope they had never been able to have. He is still considered a hero there, and he should be. Even if his success rate wasn't exactly 100%, contemporary history and science is clear that he saved way, way more people than any negative outcomes that may have occurred. So this dude, like, in their town, there's statues. There's the guy. There would be no this town. They were on their way out because it just kept fucking their ass up, right? And because, you know, it's like not only is, again, it's that endemic nature what's always there and kind of ready to come out. It just needs the right opportunity of someone unprotected. But also, they're in Scotland. They don't have tons of resources. They got some resources that they're exporting, but they got to import everything else. So people are coming in also. And then pandemic hits because that immunity is kind of lapsed from the adults.
You're interchanging pandemic and
Well, epidemic, I should say. I shouldn't say pandemic. God, I'm so programmed by the news. Pandemic is when it's all over the world, which it was, I guess. But I mean, in this community, it was an epidemic. Okay. Pandemics were, well, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Pan means everywhere.
You can't escape.
Yeah, pan is everything, everywhere, you know. So first, he would carefully select patients with only the mildest cases from which to harvest the smallpox virus. He would then dry them over a fire that he covered with peat, creating smoke. He believed this reduced the disease's intensity. Once dry, he would place the scabs between pieces of glass and bury them underground, surrounded by a substance that he gathered from a species of laurel tree wood called camphor, which was long known in folk medicine to contain antibacterial properties. It was essentially a preservative that kept the organic material from decaying. He would leave batches of the virus in this state for 7 to 8 years to further reduce its virulence.
Oh.
Okay? So he's like burying batches of this shit so that he has these supplies.
Yeah.
And he's got it all timed out based on these ideas that he's having, how to make it the most minor, least severe. Maybe they just get sick for a little bit. Maybe they get a few sores or whatever, but nothing like what can happen when you're just putting right from someone's sore into them or whatever. So they're trying to better this, refine this. Whether what they're doing is doing anything or not, there may or may not, we don't know. There haven't been any scientific confirmation that these things were doing this. It could just be time. That it just gets weaker and weaker with time also. So it's not like, oh, well, he was on to something, but you can see the process, the thinking, the scientific process he's going through of like, how do I make this better? Well, let me try this. And then, recording his results and keeping track of what's going on and developing this process and this, it's fucking pretty wild. He had even invented a knife for the procedure, one that was able to simply lift a few layers of the skin. The procedure was completely bloodless. Once he created the flap, he would put a small amount of the prepared pus in the opening, covering it back up with the skin. After the quick and painless procedure, he sent the patient home with a bandage, or what we would call a cabbage leaf. So you go, he'd make this little bloodless cut, put this stuff that he had prepared through this whole process, and then he put a cabbage leaf on it and send you home like, there you go, that'll do you. Scotland. In the fucking 18th century. Holy shit. Today, researchers and historians believe that notions had somehow come across understanding and details of the practice from Eastern sources or travelers, as his practice was more in line with those cultures rather than developments that were coming from Britain. So they think that he actually maybe had heard from a trader or a sailor, about this thing. And he's like, really, tell me more about that. Yeah. Because the stuff that would have come in from Britain would have been like, bloody and different, So he seems to have got a hold of something very folkish, very older, because he's doing all these earthy kind of folk medicine things. Obviously, Scotland having that in their heritage as well. So but pretty fascinating. By 1754, the Royal College of Physicians officially sanctioned the use of variolation. Upon this declaration, England quickly became the global center for inoculation against smallpox, doing further study and bringing the practice to other regions. Smallpox was hitting England hard at this time. So when this process came into official sanction, basically be able to do it, it became an industry because there was so much smallpox going on. And then because of that development, they began to take their stuff and carry it into other regions as well. Okay. In 1769, a British physician inoculated Catherine the Great, right, the Tsar of Russia's wife, and her teenage son before the royal court in Russia. She then had him variolate 140 of those in attendance. It had been reported that in preparation for this, she had a relay of horses set up in case something went south and she had to get the doctor and the young son that had accompanied him on his trip out of Russia in a hurry. She had horses set up like, okay, if something goes wrong, get the fuck out of here. This is Russia. We fight. Like, that's the first step. We fight. So so she's like preparing this escape route for him. They were all successful, however, and the practice flourished in Russia, saving hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives. The French were the last to accept it, only allowing it to be performed starting in 1752, and only after the heir to the throne had been brutally killed by smallpox. Drastic actions were needed to protect the throne, so the king called for his next heir to be inoculated in public for all to see. Okay, so like they're like, oh no, we're not doing whatever French do. Oh no, but then his son, and it's like the realm's at risk. Yeah. If my other heir dies, my kingdom's done. So he's all of a sudden, you know what? Let's try this. Might as well, because I mean, what are the other odds? He's going to die, maybe. Because it's not great. Upon the success of the treatment, it gained acceptance and approval from the crown and the public in France, and so it spread around France. The concept first hits America sometime around 1706 in Boston. The Puritan minister and leader there, named Cotton Mather, had heard of the procedure from one of his West African slaves named Onesimus. So let me just break in here for a second and talk about something. There's a great book, actually. I read most of it, not all of it. It's called Pax Americana. Elizabeth Fenn, I believe is her name. I'm not going to talk a lot about America here, but smallpox affected everything, and then its tentacles reached into even stuff that we wouldn't connect with that. For instance, when the fucking Portuguese and Spanish, Columbus, it's called the Columbian Exchange in her book. When Columbus comes over, he ends up in Hispaniola, which is Haiti and the Dominican Republic today, right? He finds 1 million peaceful, non-warring, complex society of indigenous people. They were called the Arawaks, I believe. They totally welcomed the Spanish with open arms. But of course, they in return said, these people are easy to enslave. And so they started destroying their culture and doing all this stuff to kind of like break down their will with the aim of enslaving them physically to work the land. But the fucking Europeans brought with them disease. Yeah. And one of the diseases they brought was smallpox. Yeah. And between smallpox and measles together worldwide in history has killed more people than gunpowder. Okay. Yeah. Like it is the leading fucking thing that has destroyed us in our history. Yeah. So they show up and they end up reducing this million population of this thriving culture to 15,000 people. Yeah. They fucking all die, which makes them not good slaves, obviously, right? And so they turn to Africa, where they had been doing this for a long time. They found those people had already been exposed to fucking smallpox. They weren't immune. There was a lot of overlap between European and African diseases because of trade and travel and all the exploration. And so the African slave trade was to a large degree a thing that happened because they had to shift gears because of smallpox that they brought over that destroyed the native populations here. And so we started importing fucking African slaves into the New World. And we needed cotton. Europe needed cotton. That's how it fucking ended up in the plantations of the southern United States worked by African slaves. Was because smallpox, the people over here, we would have enslaved them.
Yeah.
But we didn't because they've kept fucking dying because we were bringing all these invisible weapons with us. And they got us back. They think syphilis got to Europe because of doing business over here, you know, like Aztecs sent a little welcome package home or like, you know, somewhere, some culture in Mexico. So, you know, there you go, Europeans, deal with that one. But anyway, just a side note that the impact of this
it's wild.
is fucking huge, cultural, and
History.
we're still dealing with systemic issues that rose from it, even though it's gone. So, like, this is a thing that defined everything, right?
Yeah.
Which I found, I could not stop thinking about this for like 2 weeks now. It's been mind-blowing. So like I said, the concept first gets to America about 1706, hits in Boston, right? And this dude Cotton Mather hears about it. And the way he hears about it is that he's got this black slave from West Africa named Onesimus. And he noticed they had a scar on his arm and they weren't susceptible to smallpox. And he asked him, what the fuck? You know, he didn't say that, obviously. He's a Puritan minister, but he was thinking, what the fuck? But he said, why art thou not whatever smallpox? And Onesimus like, oh, dude, we when we were kids, we fucking got that taken care of. Our moms, you know, went and haggled over a price and, you know, whatever. We were inoculated, very elated, essentially. And, you know, he had noticed that and these other people from his part of Africa also, you know, and so Cotton Mather's like, interesting, right? Because there's proof here. He's like noticing, like, you know, even some people from European places coming to the New World were succumbing to it, and yet these African slaves they're bringing weren't, right? Several years later, Cotton Mather, wound up getting his hands on that paper written by the British physicians in India. The one that Lady Mary, what's-her-name, used to bring it to Britain. Remember? She came across that paper those doctors wrote, those two doctors, and she's like, oh, okay, this is a shit. We need to bring it to England, right? Well, Cotton Mather in fucking Boston somehow gets his hands on this, right? So he poured over the research and begins discussing it with everyone he could. So now he's on a fucking bender or like on one around variolation, just like Lady Mary was, but over here in Boston. In 1721, another smallpox outbreak descended on Boston, and Mather took the chance to take action. Fighting for permission to perform the procedure, he faced intense opposition from the religious and other science-wary groups, right? They're all like, it's because we're sinners. You know, they're Puritans. So they're like, oh, God's scourging us. And just to be fair, your God that you're following, Christians, that is his game. If you read the Bible, he fucks people up like this, you know? There's shit in the Bible that some people think that might be a description of smallpox. It talks about sores and pus oozing and all kinds of shit. And, you know, I would just say if your God is killing 80% of babies primarily, maybe we need to, after we destroy this thing, we need to go destroy your God because that's just psychopathic. But yeah, there was a lot of opposition, and it was a lot of that. Like, hey, we should stop being Sodom and Gomorrah, and women should stop showing their ankles, or, you know, or like, you know, we should stop drinking beer, you know, or lifting a hay bale on Saturday, or whatever it is that got them all riled up. But they're like, God's punishing us. And so there was a lot of pushback of like, this isn't right. We're playing God, you know, and all this kind
You
of
shouldn't heal it. You should let it
just run its course because God's in control, man. It's going to be fine. Or to put it in today's context, hey, the universe can go on, you know. If it's meant to be, it'll be. We can go on with all the nonsense that we say. Luckily, Mather prevailed. A friend and surgeon named Zabdiel Boylston, which is a crazy name, Zabdiel, strongly supported him and winds up variolating 300 patients, with only 6 winding up being lost to smallpox. And you're like, 6 out of 300? Holy shit. Of the 6,000 who were infected naturally in town, over 1,000 of them died. This is like way better. Okay. Of course, Cotton, along with his brother Increase Mather, also drove and fed the witch accusation craze and subsequent trials in Salem. So, mixed bag. So it's like, nice job, Cotton. Fuck you, Cotton.
Yeah.
Like, he was fucking that dude. He was all mixed up in that shit.
Yeah.
And playing games that got people killed. Innocent people killed. Thanks to Mather and Boylston pushing this practice, it quickly spread throughout the colonies, saving America's future in all likelihood. Listen, if this would have kept going, we would not be here.
Yeah, we wouldn't have been started.
This would not have happened.
Few people.
But because of the success, because people went like, shit, 1,000 of us died, and then they only lost fucking 6 out of their 300, we should all be doing this. And so quickly, it spread.
Yeah.
People took it to other places, set up shop probably. I mean, that's what they did. Like, hey, come on, blah, 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 and they sold their shit, but it started to spread. And it saved us. We could have been really fucked up. Mm-hmm. By 1775, George Washington, we all know him, called for the entire Continental Army to be inoculated. By the way, if you go in the I went in the Army in 1991. I got so many fucking shots. Don't even talk to me about I don't like getting so many vaccinations. They lined us up in a gauntlet of people with highly pressurized vaccine guns that shot. There were no needles.
Yeah.
They shot streams of high pressure vaccine into you, just broke through your skin and went into you. And there was 5 or 6, and you would step forward and on both arms, and you step forward, and step forward, and by the time you're done, you've been fucking just blood's dripping from your arm. You're all ripped up. And then they made us go in a room, drop our pants, and they did shove needles. Our fucking the fucking penicillin shots were straight in the ass, and those were the worst, by the way. Those sucked. But we got a lot. And George Washington, when he heard of this process, he's like, that's it. Everybody's getting this done. Because all it takes is, that's it.
Yeah.
After the war, as cities and populations grew, smallpox found frequent footholds and opportunities, driving the acceptance and popularity of the treatment even further. Again, probably saving America. So the colonies, this thing came in, and we stopped dying from smallpox at such large numbers. Mm-hmm. The Revolutionary Army, the army that we depended on to fight the revolution, was inoculated. Mm-hmm. And all it took was smallpox hitting them, and we would have lost the war, and we'd all be sipping tea and fucking talking funny, right? And then after the war, as we became our own country and began to see what was possible in that, and cities began to develop and began to gather in these urban areas, well, that created a really great place. Because the thing about smallpox, and this is going to be so relevant to us today, it wasn't just about touching you. Mm-hmm. It was spread through the air. Mm-hmm. It was airborne. Mm-hmm. Airborne viruses are the worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. So anyone who says coronavirus isn't as bad as this, you're right. In a lot of cases, it's not as bad or deadly. The problem is it's spread in the air through respiratory means, right? Which means it spreads fast because we're together a lot. Mm-hmm. That's why all this social distancing. It's not to control you or break your will. It's because when we're breathing in the same space, this disease just hops between us, and it's going to wipe out someone. Mm-hmm. Not you, maybe. But what about your fucking dad? What about my goddamn dad? Fuck you. He got the vaccine, by the way. But I would be really not... really close to wanting to kill you if you did something like that, infected my dad because you're an asshole or something like that. Like, that's what's going on. And so with smallpox, tight, packed in urban areas, which began to develop in the wake of the Revolutionary War, as we literally now are like, what are we going to, let's start doing American shit, right? And it starts spreading through these places. And so they begin inoculating all these people, virulating all these people, doing this procedure, and people stopped dying. And those cities took, and they continued to develop instead of just digging graves every year kind of thing, right? Makes sense? Mm-hmm. So with this in mind, let's zip back and rejoin young Edward at the time of his inoculation against smallpox in school in 1757. Though the procedure was a success and his smallpox case was relatively mild, the British version of the process kind of left him with some lingering health issues for most of his life. Prior to being inoculated, Edward and the other boys were first bled a few times, supposedly to drain their systems of impurities in preparation for the procedure. Not only were they drained, but a big part of science back then, they were... It's kind of like now we're like, come do hot yoga so you'll sweat out your impurities.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that, by the way.
That's not how your
And
body works.
they kind of had that same thinking back then. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Just rather than sweat, they're like, let's me
bleed it
bleed
out.
you and make you puke. And so they gave you emetics, which would make you throw up. And then they would cut you open and bleed you, right? To the point of where you're weak. People would faint, you know, like it was a lot of blood. It wasn't just like a little bit. And so they had this whole process where, like, first they spent a couple weeks bleeding them, purging them.
Oh, God.
Yeah, okay, it gets worse. They were also put on a very small diet and brought essentially to an emaciated and malnourished state.
What the fuck?
They thought that this helped. This is the craziness of, like, fucking this time period. They would then do the inoculation on the boys, sending them immediately to some stables that served as a quarantine holding site, crammed together as they dealt with the symptoms of the disease and were no longer contagious for about 14 days typically. Makes some of our modern complaints a little fucking ridiculous, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I have to wear a mask. It's like, okay. This motherfucker was drained of blood, forced to throw up countless times, shoved fucking smallpox into, sent to stables where he sat with other sick boys for 2 weeks while he shivered, broke out in sores, did the whole thing, wrote it out until they determined that he wasn't contagious anymore, and then they let him out. So, you know, shelter in place with Netflix sounds a little bit different, but... While he didn't continue any further in school, he was very keen on learning, especially science and medicine, and he was particularly fascinated with the natural sciences. He was a curious kid who probably was bored in school and also happened to have the kind of privilege that allowed you the leisure and resources to get your own education. He fed his interests until at age 12, Edward was apprenticed. So, by all accounts, again, remember, this is not a poor family. Okay, these people own shit. They're tied into the nobility. They're high society. They have money, right? His brothers were studying in Oxford. His dad was, had gone to Oxford. This wasn't like they weren't lower class. And so, as a privileged kid, he spent 1 year in school at grammar school. At the age of 8, he went to school for exactly 1 year. Came home. But because he didn't have shit to do, he wasn't working in a fucking factory or out in the fields. He didn't have to do any of that shit. So he just got to, like, read books that they could afford to have and talk to people who they were in the social circles that he could talk to. Yeah. And he was just super curious. You know, we know tons of people. One of our sons is like, I was this boy who was like, school's stupid and like failed classes when, you know, but I was like curious.
Reading all the things.
Yeah. And that's kind of how he was. But then at age 12, it came time for him to like do something, because back then you're like, what the fuck are you doing? You're 12 and you don't have a career going yet, you know? You haven't done anything of any note. So he gets apprenticed to a man named Daniel Ludlow. Want to guess what his profession was?
Doctor?
Daniel Ludlow was a fucking surgeon.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, he's 12. I'm just saying. Imagine, just to get that in your mind. He's a boy.
Surgeon at 12,
right.
Yes.
So this was not a physician or a doctor during this time. Surgery was a separate occupation from being a physician.
Okay.
They did not go to medical school.
Oh.
Surgery was viewed as more of a skilled trade, complete with hands-on training through master-apprentice relationships.
Okay.
The association that governed them was the Barber Surgeons Company of London, starting in 1540, lasting until the surgeons split off on their own in 1745. And then by the end of the century, they would start bringing surgery closer to the medical field, and eventually it would become a part of it. And understand, that whole barber surgeon thing was way before this.
Yeah.
They were not cutting hair. In fact, even in the barber surgeon union, barbers couldn't do surgery and surgeons couldn't do barbering.
Okay.
It was just they were connected together because they used the same skills and tools of the trade. Fucking razors. Sharp shit, right?
Yeah.
So while early on, sure, he could cut your hair and then fucking slice you open, but it wasn't like that at this time, and it hadn't been for a while.
Okay.
And surgeons, though it wasn't like cut here, do this. They had people within their industry also who were very curious and very into. So they did extensive anatomical studies. They produced a lot of early scientific knowledge around that kind of stuff. They were scientists, and they were as good as doctors to a large degree, but they didn't go to medical school.
Yeah.
So they weren't referred to as doctor. They were referred to as Mr.
Okay.
Mr. Ludlow.
Okay.
He wouldn't be Dr. Ludlow. But it was kind of a master skilled tradesman and not so much a doctor. But they did a lot of shit, and obviously it started like in the battlefield and medics and stuff. And then it turned into like the local, who's got the sharp shit? The barber, well, I need this thing cut out of my leg. All right, come here. I think I could do that. And then, hey, I could make some money on this. And next thing you know, barber surgeon. For 6 years, Edward studied under and assisted Mr. Ludlow, leaving at age 18, trained in the practice of surgery. That was quite a long apprenticeship, by the way. And I saw it explained in two different ways. One, either he was highly trained when he came out, but most of the accounts are he was such a fucking flighty, lazy, unreliable little prick that he couldn't hardly get him to do the hours or whatever. And it took him 8. It was kind of like the guy that took 6 years to graduate and get his bachelor's. Kind of like that's what it felt like. Is that what was going on? Not that, wow, 8 years. Because that's a long apprenticeship for a surgeon. And a lot of people chalk that up based off of people, contemporaries describing him, friends and stuff. They're like, oh, yeah, it would take him 8 years to finish that. Milking that student loan. They didn't have student loans back then. He went on to another apprenticeship then, something more like what we would call a medical internship at a major hospital in London. After his 2 years of study and mentorship there, he returned home to Berkeley, establishing himself as the country family doctor for the region, an area that covered 1,600 square miles, by the way. That was his domain of doctoring, right? Holy shit. In an age of horseback, right? Though he still was never technically an actual physician, right? He didn't go to medical school.
But he came back and established himself as a doctor.
He did, but he had done like what we would call a medical internship. And that's what I'm saying is like, even though he went to surgery, he went to a surgery apprenticeship and not medical school. He still had a really large, more than anyone you knew, baseline understanding of medical knowledge. And then he went and spent 2 years at this hospital where he was under the tutelage of several prominent doctors and physicians. And so he really did get the equivalent probably of that. And again, he's a rich, moneyed prick. He can do whatever the goddamn he wants to, right? And so it's kind of like that too. There's privilege involved in this. No one else, no person coming up through the, up lower classes was doing this kind of shit. But he's the doctor there now in Berkeley, his hometown. He came home, and it seemed like that's what he was out doing. Like, I'm always going to go home and fucking do this. Before we get to the relevant bits, we need to just consider how interesting this dude actually was. His life is filled with amazing things. He published the first scientific study on the hibernation habits of the hedgehog. A study that consisted of seeking out sleeping hedgehogs so he could shove a thermometer up their asses to record their temperature during hibernation. His publication just records just countless of these. So there's even report in there where he the thermometer broke off in the hedgehog's ass, like just crazy. But I mean, he was a naturalist. He was very interested in the natural world. Okay. And remember, this is the time of Darwin and shit like that. Okay. Like this is when that world was exploding, especially amongst the rich who had time because they had servants and all that stuff. And they're like, what should we do? Let's go look at birds today. Like most people were like, oh, fucking birds. I got to work, 18 hours a day. He was the first to observe and publish the behavior of the cuckoo bird, which is really fucked up. What he saw as he studied them, he kind of sent his nephews out, by the way, to go do all this, was that the female cuckoos would lay their egg in the nests of hedge sparrows, leaving it amongst the eggs the unsuspecting mother was already waiting to hatch. So kind of like just popped her eggs amongst the other eggs, right? And it's weird because their eggs are giant. And then the other ones are tiny, and the mother bird's just like, whatever, it's an egg. Once the cuckoo chick hatched, it spent the first few days of its life systematically murdering the other eggs or chicks, if they had hatched already, by hoisting them over the side of the nest to send them splatting on the ground below.
Oh my gosh.
Then they alone would get all of the food that the mother bird brought back, while the cuckoo mother was long gone and not even giving a shit about the whole thing. I was just like, peace. People didn't believe him in the naturalist community at first. Not until an artist out producing illustrations for naturalist publications caught the behavior in her drawings did the community finally accept this reality. Edward even went on to do detailed anatomical research on the cuckoo chicks, finding they had evolutionary traits designed to help them perform their genocidal acts. He found their scapulas were spread extra far apart with huge indentations between them for the first 2 weeks of the chick's life. He surmised this allowed them to cup the eggs or chicks' bodies, trapping them on their backs so they could toss them overboard. A feature that disappears after about 14 days, turning into a more typical configuration. This discovery actually caused Charles Darwin to revise his On the Origins of Species book. So... he even attached lead weights to the cuckoo, so they like snuck up when the cuckoo chick hatched, and they attached lead weights to its feet to keep it from being able to push the eggs over to get enough like hoisted up, and they couldn't do it. And so they did all these experiments on these things. But this is a true story. That this is how we know this is how cuckoos operate. He was the first one to notice that, and it was so weird and so morbid and like holy shit, unnatural almost, that they were like, "Fuck you, man, that sounds crazy."
It's not peaceful.
Yeah, I know. And then this artist is out there. She's like, "Holy shit!" She starts drawing it, and they're just like, "Oh my goodness." This research and the publication of his results, though rejected at first because it was too poorly written. He was not. This guy was smart, big picture guy, not a details guy.
Right.
And so he submits his paper, and they're just like, all rubbish or whatever they said. And they're do this again, you know. But eventually became the reason he was given his FRS. So an FRS in England is a Fellow of the Royal Society. It's an award given by a court of judges of the Royal Society for contributions and discoveries in the advancements of science, especially the natural sciences. Okay, it's a very high honor.
Because of his discovery of the cuckoo bird.
Because this was a brand new discovery that no one knew. It advanced our scientific knowledge. And so it's not easy to get this. And so, you know, it was an honor to have your FRS. That's like if someone has that in England, that means they're a part of an elite group of thinkers and contributors to scientific knowledge, right? Edward was the first person to launch a hot air balloon in Britain. Again, he's fucking rich, and they sit around drinking with his buddies and be like, dude, you know what would be funny? We did a hot air balloon. Because, I mean, it had been going on in France, right? Paris seems to be, you know, we think, around there in France. And, you know, but no one it hadn't happened. It wasn't widespread. It was just kind of a thing that, have you heard this happened, right? Yeah. Apparently, one of his balloons wound up coming down in a park owned by a local rich dude. He had a daughter, and after a classic meet cute, plus 10 years of courting, Jesus, they were married. He established still held science around bird migrations. There's still facts about bird migrations that this dude observed, recorded, and, you know, confirmed. He even was the first person to discover and dig up a dinosaur skeleton in Britain. It was a plesiosaur. He was a big fossil hunter, and he fucking was the first guy to find that. So this guy, man, he's just doing shit, right?
Yeah.
So this guy, he didn't sit around and let dust collect anywhere. However, he was also described as kind of a lackadaisical, not overly detailed-oriented, and kind of a slacker at times. He didn't always follow through on his obsessions and seemed to get bored and unreliable fairly often. Enough so that some of his contemporaries have described him as such in their accounts of him. He sounded kind of fun, too, holding weekly convivials with the medical community around the area. They would get together at the pub, drink, tell stories, and every once in a while talk about medical breakthroughs or theories, if it wasn't too late. They were kind of like, hey, let's get together and talk about medicine and just being doctors, man. They're like, okay. And then next thing you know, they're like, oh, just drunk. They call them convivials, which I love. He was known as what they would have called a good time Charlie. So how does Edward factor into the Great Smallpox War? Well, in the 1760s, scientific researchers began studying a phenomenon that had been observed for some time but wasn't understood. It had long been popular knowledge that milkmaids had some kind of weird resistance to smallpox. It was rare that they suffered any kind of reaction. If they did, it was nothing like the battle everyone else seemed to endure. In fact, later in life, Edward himself would recount that it was an overheard conversation between two milkmaids that first got him thinking about better ways to deal with smallpox. The young ladies had been talking with each other, bragging about how their pretty faces would never be scarred or messed up because everyone knows milkmaids don't get smallpox. By 1768, an English doctor named John Fuster had confirmed what was going on here. It turns out there's a disease similar to smallpox in cows. It was called cowpox. Nailed it. It was an animal-borne disease that was transmissible to humans, manifesting in very minor symptoms, and even more importantly, it wasn't spread between humans like smallpox. Fuster confirmed that exposure to cowpox built up immunity to smallpox, resulting in milkmaids rarely being stricken with the disease because of their proximity to the cows. It was typically a few blisters on the hands, and that's it. Maybe a low-grade fever. No horrible scarring, no blindness, no community spread. You see, there was a major drawback to variolation. While it provided an immune response and protection for the inoculated, it also made them a disease spreader for a couple weeks after the procedure. Collateral infections and deaths were common and a huge problem. People were frantically searching for something safer and better. See, the problem with inoculation, with variolation, was you had smallpox.
Yeah.
And then you gave it to all the people you came in contact with.
Yeah.
Yes, you were going to develop immunity. But if they didn't have that immunity, they were probably going to fucking die. This is how a lot of adults came down with smallpox. Was through collateral spread through inoculated children. They were literal smallpox bombs everywhere because they were going in and having it put in their fucking arm, you know? And so that was a huge problem. It's like, yes, but at the same time, we're creating problems also, you know, so it's like, yes, we're winning, but it's also not great. Physicians in England and Germany began wondering if there was a way to inoculate people with cowpox in order to protect them against smallpox. All of the protection, none of the collateral spread and destruction. There were medical research who had even inoculated people with cowpox to confirm the immune response, taking the pus from the udders of infected cows. And so cowpox, they would get this disease, and they would get the sores on their udders, and then the milkmaids would milk, and they would come in contact, and if they had a scratch or a cut, it wasn't just touching it, but like if it got inside of them, they would come down with cowpox, which was this very minor thing. It was just kind of an annoyance that milkmaids got every once in a while, right? And so there had been some research that had researchers on this trail, a lot of people in different countries going, how can we do this? Sharing information, trying to figure this out. And they'd even, like, one guy was a farmer and he had a cow that had cowpox and had heard about this in town, and he actually inoculated his kids with cowpox that he harvested from the sores on this cow. And so people had done this, but there still was like really, it wasn't scientific.
Right.
It was just really tied more to folklore and kind of ideas like, you know, they weren't really sure. Some people were starting to think we're onto something, but we don't know what that something is. Amongst these scientific pioneers was Edward, and it is he who would bring the most important contribution to humankind. While he didn't outright discover something new necessarily, what he did do was scientifically prove and improve the science around this idea, leading to his world-defining contribution. He had been working, studying, experimenting, and refining his hypothesis for years, culminating in a human trial in 1796. He had already inoculated 16 children with the cowpox virus with no negative results, right? So 16 kids at his home. He had them come in, inoculated them in both arms with the cowpox virus that he had taken from cows, let them back into the community where smallpox was, right? and no infections, right? After observing them for some time.
Yeah.
Okay. However, it was time to put his new hypothesis and the conclusions he thought he was destined for to the ultimate test. On May 14th of that year, he inoculated an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. He was the son of Edward's one-time gardener. He had scraped some cowpox pus from the hands of a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms. Okay, so change one. He's taking it from a human now. He's taking cowpox from a milkmaid and not from a cow. Okay. She had been infected by one of her cow buddies named Blossom. And if you were wondering why we know that, it's because Blossom was celebrated after her death by having her hide removed and hung on the wall of St. George's Medical College Library, where she still remains today. Pretty cool. Edward inoculated young Jimmy in both arms. He came down with the typical low-grade fever and developed a single blister on his hand. That's it. Good as new a few days later. So far, so good. Now came the actual moment of truth. After 6 weeks had gone by, Edward injected James with living, active smallpox.
Yeah.
Not shit that you tried to make mild and stuff like that, right? This was like, let's give him something that we know is going to kill him, right?
Oh,
I mean, that's what's going on here. Nothing happened in the weeks that followed. He waited an extended amount of time and once again injected young Jimmy with active smallpox in both arms. Nothing happened in the weeks that followed again. He had scientifically demonstrated and proven there was a safer way to inoculate people against smallpox. See, that no one had done the science, right?
Yeah.
No one had done he had been refining this. He had been studying this. He'd been doing experimentation and trying to figure this out. And while it wasn't this thing that he alone discovered, he is the one that solidified the science. He enters the history books as the one who proved this, right? No one else went the farmer didn't go let me chuck you in a room full of kids with smallpox and see if this worked, right? They're just he did the science, right? He even in fact, another thing he did was he proved that we could take it from human to human. Now, in the years that followed, they would still take it from cows for a long time, but he did prove that in his study, right? He even hypothesized that cowpox had started as a horse disease, actually, with transmission to cows likely through human farriers, like horseshoers, who would often milk cows also. Ideas that were proven through DNA research centuries later. What the fuck? Nailed it. This new thing needed a name, though. It wasn't smallpox they were using, so calling it variolation was improper and no longer accurate. In 1803, a Plymouth surgeon named Richard Dunning decided to call this newfound technology vaccination. And in so doing, he immortalized the real hero of the story because you see, in Latin, vacca means cow. So they're like, I think it's called variola vaccinae is the virus cowpox, And so vaccination comes from that Latin root for cow. So it's basically being cowified. Jenner had quite literally introduced a miracle, a hope that nobody really ever thought we would have. With the increased acceptance of variolation leading to the development of vaccines, infant mortality rates dropped from over 35% in the 1740s to under 15% by the 1840s. And then on till today where it's a fucking blip, right?
Yeah.
Cities boomed, populations grew, modernism accelerated forward. People had a brand new lease on life. It changed everything. It did. Like even the idea to build anything. Why? When you're constantly fighting disease, when you're constantly having people wiped out, when, the throne is changing constantly because people are being... It really did. And we still progressed and struggled through all of that, right? Which shows kind of the resiliency of us as the superorganism. But it kept us down for a long time. And once this thing released us from it, things changed quickly, drastically. We had long lives to develop an immense amount of knowledge and skill and do greater things, It's like, when you die at 40, you can learn a lot, but you can only learn as much as you can get in 40 years. When you live to 100, all of a sudden you look at people like Einstein and these people, they were contributing stuff later in life as they were more wise and, a lot of times, and we wouldn't have that. People would be dying, and we would be losing. Think about the minds we lost 500,000 people a year in Europe through this kind of pre-Enlightenment period. We lost a lot of people that would have maybe changed our world even more.
Yeah.
That's the reality of things. And this changed fucking everything. Now you get your kid vaccinated, which it was still kind of like an inoculation. They would still make the little scratch and they would still rub the cowpox into you. And you would have a fever for a couple of days and feel kind of achy or whatever. But then your kid was protected from smallpox. And now he fought until his deathbed that it was lifelong immunity. It turned out to not be that. And eventually they re-inoculated people too later on.
One of the boosters you get?
Yeah, like a booster, right? And so, there were things definitely he was wrong about. But what he did that is the pivot point of our modern age. And it's that long ago, not that long ago. That means that the world we live in right now, the life that we expect, our ability to to dream and to say our whole life is ahead of us kind of thing. That's just been the last couple 100 years or maybe even the last 150 years. Right.
Yeah.
And it's because of this motherfucker, not just him. Right, as we saw. Lots of people.
Yeah.
And maybe if he didn't do it, someone else would have done it. But he did it, and so we're talking about him. And it changed everything. Everything, right? We would go on to use this new understanding in science to face off with other plagues and diseases that stood in our way. Polio, tetanus, diphtheria, pertussis, right? Like whooping cough. Yeah. TB, all that kind of shit.
Yeah.
We continued to find ways to battle these biological threats. In 1977, after a war that had lasted for thousands and thousands of years, victory was finally and fully declared. Smallpox had become the first infectious disease to be eradicated worldwide. Once a constant threat and destroyer of children, we entered the 1980s. The fucking 1980s. I mean, it wasn't happening here, obviously. We'd vaccinated people a long time ago, but we're talking worldwide.
Yeah.
That means in leading up to the 80s, people were still living kind of with some of this stuff going on. We entered the 1980s with this ancient enemy buried and gone. This tale is one that made our lives possible. Not in some figurative or symbolic way, but in a very literal sense. Without this breakthrough, we would still be living in fear, bracing for waves of this evil virus to pass through our homes, leaving us with fewer and fewer of our children, family members, co-workers, and loved ones. And we owe it all to cows. Pretty wild. So the reason we told that story today and why we went through that is because really what we're going to talk about, because this is about belief. Now, this episode is about belief. The belief that we can do something against these things. That we can think outside the boundaries and come up with solutions, unnatural maybe solutions, or maybe natural solutions that just creative natural solutions. But we believe we could beat it, that we could fight it, right? Whereas for thousands of years, that was not the belief. There was no fighting it. It was spiritualized in so many ways. It was called so many things. It was seen as judgments from so many gods. There was no, we can do something against this until someone came across this process to, in that observation. And then we started doing things against
observation, which is science.
Exactly. And the reason we told this story is because really what we want to talk about is the anti-vax situation. And so next week, I wanted to lay the groundwork by telling the story of vaccinations. And from this guy's discovery, we would move on until we're producing. We found out we could take immunity from someone, reproduce it, and put it into someone else. And so next thing you know, we have an industry around immunization. We're able to create a whole bunch of it and get it out to everybody that's at risk. And public health stuff starts coming and all this kind of stuff. Much of this was built around fighting this disease.
Yeah.
Public health, these kinds of ideas and others. But I mean, this one primarily. Someone fucked us up bad. Yeah. And it's just a fascinating story of how people who just kept pulling at threads.
So we don't have any smallpox anymore?
No, does not exist. The last natural infection of smallpox was 1975.
Wow.
And so when the 1980s dawned, they said, it's gone. Yeah. Now, that's why we don't dig up those fucking graves and shit either, by the way, because, and I guarantee you there's smallpox on this planet in some lab somewhere. guarantee you, because they want to know what if it does reemerge, kind of stuff comes back different or something like that. Yeah. But the reason I want to attack the anti-vax kind of belief is because I just told you this story. And there is a side story to this story. Okay. Because I think a lot of the anti-vax people today think that, oh man, it's a good thing I live in the 21st century and we have the internet and all these people that are telling me the truth. And I woke up to this new information, that medical science, because they want to hurt us. By the way, did you see any people in this whole story that were like, how can I control the people through medical, how can I force them to? No, they were saying, I want to keep you from fucking dying. Line up and let me do this to you because it works.
A lot of them had been affected themselves by the disease, and they were like, I want a solution.
Exactly. So alongside, from day fucking one, there were people saying the same goddamn thing that people are saying now.
Okay.
We are not experiencing something new. We are experiencing a side group of people on the other side who are using the same arguments from the same emotional places as people did back then, whether it be religious or health oriented or danger to their children and all this stuff. Not like, 10 years later, the end. No, while he was trying to develop this, people were fighting people over this from all different perspectives, saying it's against God, it's against nature, it's this, it's going to harm people. Because again, that the spiritual mind frame of like, you're trying to do something to me. And so it's important for us to know these stories because as we're in a time now where we're experiencing a new disease that's being newly fought with new shit, for some reason our tendency is to suspect that. And it's because these people created this space between we wouldn't be thinking that if coronavirus was a thing that was fucking us up for thousands of years. We would be lining up, except for the few crazy people, which we're going to talk about through all this time. It's just now we have a crazy people spreading machine called the internet. So now we're replicating crazy people at a rate that we can't keep up with. And so we need to talk about the history behind the anti-vaccination movement. And we're not going to I'm not going to talk about the vaccination. I don't fucking know shit. I'm not a goddamn. There are resources out there, though. But if you go to a place and it's not something like fucking Mayo Clinic or John Hopkins or Oxford, it's something that's like these smart.
Where the science is.
Yeah, you go do that. If it's like,
Mr. YouTube.
Beastmaster 69, don't listen to them. Like they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Yeah. And so luckily in the past, some people who did know what the fuck was going on, or at least were trying desperately to find out what the fuck was going on, saved our ass and created our world. We owe everything to that guy. I mean, to them, to that time. We do. We wouldn't have this. We would have a different world that was nothing like this. So I thought it was a really cool story. I really didn't know it, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I knew the cow thing. I knew that's where we got it from, but I didn't know the details around it, really. I didn't know anything about Edward Jenner other than maybe passing in some documentary where it said Edward Jenner founded vaccines or whatever. But
I didn't know any of it.
Yeah, pretty cool, right? And then, of course, we go on to beat polio, to beat, all these things that also represented a scourge. And those are things that are even closer to us.
Yeah.
This is like our parents' generation. And we had polio vaccines that were live and ended up infecting collaterally parents. We've known people in our lives that are alive right now that were affected by polio because of vaccinations to their children. And we've changed that, to make things safer. That seems to be the direction of the medical community, not these evil forces looking to force inoculate you with chips or sterilize you or make you complacent and take away your testosterone and make you feminized so you won't fight their takeover of the globe. Come on. People are trying to save your life. And the life of a bunch of other people that we should all participate in. That's what won it. People getting vaccinated. Creating the vaccine doesn't mean shit. So we have this thing. It was that people took it.
Yeah.
And the reason they took it is because the alternative was a fucking dead kid, potentially. Or themselves, if they weren't protected, So, cool story. It's like, I love those kinds of stories that seem so mundane, like a chapter in a book, the way vaccines were discovered. Yeah. But then when you really consider the implications, the far-reaching implications, America was both made possible by fighting smallpox. But then smallpox also did a lot of stuff that made America what it was in its roots that aren't so great either. You know what I mean? It fucked up. It reached into things that we don't really think about.
Yeah.
And you know, like literally when the conquistadors come into to the Aztecs and the Mayans, they come into Mexico and South America, they bring all this disease and these people are dying, and they saw it as our gods are forsaking us, and their gods clearly are taking care of them. They're not dying, we're dying. Let's switch to their fucking god. And that's how you got this weird mix of like Catholic / local kind of more magic, you know, folk kind of religions, is because I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, this wasn't just a disease we dealt with. It's a disease that fucking impacted the way we saw everything. And
it
then
adds to the layers of how they suppressed the natives here. It adds a layer to understanding how the fuck that happened.
So that's definitely part of that book, Pax Americana. I really highly encourage you to go look at it. It's well researched, great read, really easy. It's not crazy technical, and it explains basically the impact that Europeans bringing smallpox to the New World had. So when it comes to, you know, like Native Americans, it is true that we brought smallpox, and they did, because, you know, there were populations. A lot of that was unintentional. However, we've all heard the stories of like blankets with smallpox. That was actually a British person that did that. By the way, if you've ever heard of Amherst College over there, I think it's in Boston. It's in Massachusetts, right? Anyway, Amherst was the fucker that did that. That was before that was before the revolution. But that was an Englishman who did that. True story. He fucking committed genocide on purpose using smallpox because he knew that it would wipe him out. So yeah. And there was probably a lot of stuff that's just not recorded, obviously, and shit like that. But yeah, and just by nature of like French fur traders coming over to the New World, they brought with them
just being
disease.
here, they brought it.
With the native and then again there was an exchange. Like, they took shit back too, and if they went back. But yeah, it's like this meta narrative that's kind of in a way controlling things, because it's something we couldn't control until this point, until we figured out a way to control it. There was no control. There was no like smallpox is coming. You didn't fucking know. It was there. You just around every corner waiting. Who knows? You could wake up today and find out, oh shit, smallpox hit. And then you wondered, I haven't had it. And then you could be fucked, right? So anyway, thanks for listening. And we'll be back next week, and we'll talk about the anti-vax movement. That will be fun. A lot of good characters to talk about there. Good. Anyway, have a good week.